Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar entitled Advocating for Immigrant Digital Equity. My name is Brianna Broberg and I am the Midwest Regional Manager at Welcoming America. As you may know, Welcoming America is a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that leads a movement of inclusive communities becoming more prosperous by ensuring that everyone belongs. We believe that all people, including immigrants, are valued contributors and vital to the success of our communities and shared future. And that's why we are so excited for this webinar, Advocating for Immigrant Digital Equity, which in today's world is such an essential part of inclusion and belonging. Before we begin today, I want to go over just a few quick housekeeping items. Along the bottom of the screen, you'll see various features that are available today. Please use the chat feature for any questions related to the Zoom platform itself, and use the Q&A feature for any questions that you have related to the content that will be shared by our speakers. We'll address as many questions as possible during the Q&A later in the webinar. And the duration for today's webinar is 60 minutes. It is being recorded, so while we hope that you're able to join us for the entire presentation, in the event that you're unable to do so, we will send out a link to the full recording in the next few days. And now I'd like to introduce you to the distinguished speakers who are joining us today. We are so grateful to be joined by Shirley Doan and Catalina Gonzalez from World Education and by Phil Essington from the Office of Broadband and Digital Inclusion for Hennepin County, Minnesota. We'll hear first from Shirley and Catalina and later from Phil. And after our speakers have concluded the presentations, as I mentioned, we'll have the opportunity for audience Q&A, but you can feel free to ask questions via the Q&A feature on Zoom at any point during today's webinar. Now let me give a little further introduction to the folks at World Education. Shirley Doan is a senior project coordinator at World Education, where her work focuses on ESOL, digital equity and inclusion, and the ability to benefit provision of the Higher Education Act. Prior to joining World Education, Shirley was the director of a community-based ESOL program in Boston's Chinatown. Catalina Gonzalez is a senior technical advisor at World Education, where she primarily focuses on immigrant inclusion and digital equity, providing technical assistance to adult education programs across the states. Before joining World Education, Catalina managed adult education initiatives for the city of Philadelphia. I'll just mention Boston and Philadelphia are both members of the Welcoming Network. Great representation there. And now, Shirley and Catalina, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Brianna. So we are super excited to be here today talking about this important topic. This is part of a project that we have at World Education, which, by the way, is an international organization, but in the U.S., the division concentrates in supporting adult education programs. And the project that this work is part of is called Transforming Immigrant Digital Equity. And we have been working on this topic for a couple of years, and we are excited to be sharing some information with you. If you take me to the next slide, this is how our presentation is going to be organized. We're going to first talk about the Digital Equity Act to make sure that everybody's informed and knows about this act. Then we're going to talk about why should you be involved, and finally give you some ideas on how you can take action. I'm going to pass it to my colleague Shirley to tell us about the Digital Equity Act.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Thanks. So just to give a brief overview of the Digital Equity Act. So the Digital Equity Act is part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was passed in late 2021. And it came out of this bipartisan recognition that the digital divide has a deep impact, especially on overlooked and underserved communities. At the federal level, the Digital Equity Act is overseen by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, which I will shorten to NTIA, and that office is located in the U.S. Department of Commerce. Next slide. So the Digital Equity Act established 3 grants. The first is the State Planning Grant, which is formula funding for states to create a standardized digital equity plan over the course of 1 year. Then there's the State Capacity Grant, which is formula funding for states to implement what is written in their digital equity plan over the course of 5 years. And lastly, the Competitive Grant, which is competitive funding for eligible entities. So that includes both state offices and non-state entities to implement digital inclusion activities, again, over the course of 5 years. Next slide. So this timeline is from NTIA and it is already a little outdated. I think this came out last year, but as you can see, as we approach the end of 2023, states are really wrapping up their state planning. Some states have already wrapped their efforts up. But what that means as states approach the end of their year state planning is that they're going to be releasing the drafts of their state digital equity plans for public comment and review. And then in 2024, then we'll see release of notifications for the state capacity grant, as well as hopefully the competitive grant. Next slide. So what exactly do states have to include in their state digital equity plans? There are certain requirements that both the legislation and NTIA have set out. So just as a general overview, plans have to, first of all, include the barriers to digital equity that are faced by covered populations in their state. And I'll define what covered populations means on a later slide. Then the state has to set objectives for each of the 5 elements of digital inclusion. So we're talking about access and affordability to devices and technical support for those devices, accessibility of public online services such as government websites, digital literacy services, accessibility and affordability of broadband services, and individual online cybersecurity and online privacy. And then states have to connect all of those objectives or the impact of digital equity on their economic, educational, health, social, and other outcomes. Lastly, the state has to collaborate with certain listed key stakeholders in order to achieve the above objectives. And as part of that accountability process, the state has to actually explicitly list the organizations with which they collaborated with during the plan development process. Next slide. So first of all, to define key stakeholders, and I would wager that most of you fall into at least one of these buckets. So just highlighting community anchor institutions, including libraries and hospitals, nonprofit organizations, organizations that represent covered populations, which is going to be listed on the next slide, civil rights organizations, workforce development programs, if you're part of a state agency administering adult education activities, public housing authorities, and partnerships between any or all of those entities will suffice as well. Next slide. Thank you. So the DA outlines a specific list of covered populations that digital inclusion activities under the Digital Equity Act are supposed to prioritize. So a lot of these are going by existing federal definitions. So individuals who live in covered households, which means that their household income is not more than 150% of the federal poverty level. Aging individuals, meaning here individuals who are 60 years of age or older. Incarcerated individuals, other than those who are incarcerated in a federal correctional facility. Veterans, individuals with disabilities, individuals with a language barrier, so inclusive of both English language learners and also individuals who speak English natively but have low levels of literacy, individuals who are members of a racial or ethnic minority group, and then individuals who primarily reside in a rural area. So you'll see that immigrants and refugees are not explicitly listed as a covered population. That being said, overwhelming plurality of immigrants and refugees do fall into at least one of these covered populations categories. And Catalina will share some stats about that next.
Thank you. So why should you be involved? So a lot of people are referring to this investment as the infrastructural investment of our generation. And clearly it's an important amount of money that is coming down the states to support digital equity. And we know that immigrant and refugee serving organizations are key stakeholders, although sometimes the work that they have been doing in digital equity may have been referred with a different terminology or a different name. And therefore, we have been spending a lot of time making sure that immigrant and refugee service organizations are at the table, are informed about the funding opportunity that is available so that our communities can be included in this Digital Equity Act and so that they have access to the needs, to the digital equity needs that they have. So if you send me to the next slide, I want to show you this slide. And we know that immigrant serving organizations, as we said earlier, are key stakeholders. This are working with allies that are reaching and supporting digital skill development in racial and ethnic minority groups and individuals learning English as an additional language. You have been doing this work for decades. So the main takeaway here is that immigrant serving organizations are not, even though they're not named directly in the Digital Equity Act, as Shirley mentioned earlier, you are critical partners in this work, and your efforts overlap with many of the key stakeholders identified in the Digital Equity Act. Next slide, please. Shirley also mentioned that the list of covered populations under the Digital Equity Act. And so here in this slide, you will see we're just highlighting some of the main statistics or the main data points, but immigrants and refugees are represented in all covered populations. And as you can see, immigrants and refugees represent, big numbers in some of these data points that we are highlighting on this slide. Next slide. As I said earlier, immigrant and refugee services are digital inclusion partners. You have been providing digital inclusion services for many years, perhaps under a different name. But as you can see in this slide, much of your work supports digital equity in immigrant and refugee communities, providing digital literacy classes, supporting device lending, providing digital navigation, or providing support with other services and activities, including telehealth, job searching, accessing healthcare, and legal services. Next slide. Digital equity planning organizations can capitalize on the expertise and connections that you all have to support their digital equity plan. And here is the biggest call to action. It's important for all of us to be in the conversations at the planning table. We still have time in some states to do that, to make sure that states know that we can support with community outreach in multiple languages and in culturally appropriate ways. Know that we can support digital inclusion services, including digital navigations and some of the services that I mentioned earlier, and that we are trusted messengers with connections, deep connections in these communities. So now that we have discussed the role that you play in the digital equity efforts that are taking place around the country, I'm going to pass it back to Shirley to talk about what you can do right now.
Thanks. So how can you take action? On the next slide, so we'll take a look at this NTIA timeline again. And so every state received their initial planning grant funds at a different time, and that kind of affects the 1 year mark for them. So some states have already, again, wrapped up their state planning efforts and are preparing to submit their finalized state digital equity plans. And some are still in the process of doing public listening sessions and collecting data in order to draft their digital equity plan. So we're going to go through a list of actions with the acknowledgement that they don't have to be linear and that every state might be a little bit different in terms of the timeline. So on the next slide, we have, over the past year and a half, the TIDE Project has developed a number of different resources for immigrant service providers and adult education providers on how to really uplift immigrants, refugees, and other adult learners in the Digital Equity Act process. So first of all, Catalina talked a lot about how many immigrant service providers don't necessarily traditionally see themselves as digital inclusion providers, even though you might have been doing computer classes or troubleshooting or internet sign-up events for a long time. So we have a worksheet that you can make a copy of, go in, and it breaks down the different components of the Digital Equity Act and how your work as an immigrant service provider might contribute to that work. So that's the first link that Catalina is dropping in. And Catalina, if you can actually number them when we drop in, that way, because we're about to drop in a whole lot of links. So I just want to make sure our audience is not confused. So number 2, once you feel like you have a good grasp of how your work might contribute to the Digital Equity Act, identify who's leading the Digital Equity Act planning and implementation in your state. Most of the time, it's going to be your state broadband office, and that's kind of an extra level of why it's critical for you to be engaged, right? Your broadband office is going to be an expert in fiber and connectivity speeds and all the technical jargon that we might be less familiar with, but they don't necessarily know about the people-focused aspect of technology. What does it take to actually deliver digital literacy services to people who have already trouble accessing the internet? Things like that. A lot of states are still having stakeholder engagement efforts, whether that means joining a public listening session or contributing to a working group. And so again, our DEA tracker, which is the DEA by state bit.ly link, will help you figure out what's going on in your state. And that sheet continues to be updated very regularly. I'm on it all the time. Resource number 3. So if you're interested in taking a deeper look at what's required of the State Digital Equity Plan, we've annotated the template that NTIA has provided with different suggestions and recommendations for how adult education and immigrant service providers can get involved. We really break down each section, and it's both a tool meant for you to identify where you might want to contribute, but it's also something that you could send your state office or point out, like, the section of the plan that you're required to write, this is where we could be the most helpful, whether, again, it's with outreach or with providing data or partnering to get the word out for public comment. And then last but not least on this slide, number 4, so bringing others along with you. The more immigrant service or serving organizations at the table, the better. And this is a slide deck that we've developed in collaboration with the National Partnership for New Americans and with data and expertise from the Migration Policy Institute. A lot of the slides might look familiar, and that's because we've used some of them in this presentation, but it's something that you can essentially use, customize, remix in whatever way you want, and bring it to your state broadband office as an introduction for why immigrants and refugees should be included in state planning, even if they're not explicitly listed. And we've seen, different states acknowledge immigrants and refugees in their plans in different ways. In Utah, in addition to covering the 8 listed populations, their plan actually also explicitly talks about new Americans. And that is a great triumph that states are saying, okay, in addition to what we're required to do, we're also going to acknowledge the specific needs, barriers, and challenges of this separate group as well. Next slide. Okay, so I've been talking a lot about public commenting. What does that actually mean? So according to legislation, before finalizing their state digital equity plans, states have to, first of all, post the draft of that plan for public comment for at least 30 days. And then they have to consider all comments that are received during that comment period and incorporate any comments that they consider to be worthwhile. By legislation, they don't have to consider any comments that are received outside of that comment period. So it's very important to submit comments on time before the deadline. And then those comments do have value, right? When states submit their finalized plan for the next round of funding, the capacity grant funding, which will allow them to implement what is written in their plan, states have to, first of all, list any changes they made to the plan in response to the comments they received, and they have to write an individual response to each comment received during that comment period. On the next slide, please. So we've drafted a blog post to break down a little bit further about what public commenting means, what the requirements around the public comment process are. And then we also have another resource embedded in that blog post, which is a state digital equity plan checklist for immigrant inclusion in adult education. And it's just a checklist that you can refer to as you read or skim your state's digital equity plan, and keeping an eye out on, okay, are immigrant serving organizations included as fully and as deeply as they possibly can? Were they tapped as experts, as outreach partners, as data providers in all of these different areas? And also, is the public comment period actually accessible to immigrants and refugees directly? Like, are there translations available? And did the state do a good job of promoting via non-online methods as well? So that's link number 6 in the chat. And of course, we have some suggestions for what you can include in your public comment, acknowledging that, again, every state is structuring their public comment process a little bit differently. So you might be limited by whatever form or process that they have built in. And also ideas for how your immigrants and refugees themselves can get involved. So at least on the NTIA level, there is a huge push for states to really listen to individuals of lived experience. And so while, of course, our input as immigrant serving organizations is valuable, what we really ultimately want is for states to also hear directly from community members. And so again, for public commenting, right, you just have to be a member of the public. You just have to reside in that state. And so we have some brief suggestions for how immigrants and refugees, what they can include in their comments as well if they choose to engage that way. Next slide. So for those of you who are a little bit more visual like me, this, as you can see, this map was created on September 20th, so last Wednesday, and it's already outdated. So that's how fast plans are moving. So you can see that the green states are those states who are currently accepting public comments, and I think at least one state's public comment period has actually closed in the past week, although I cannot remember which state it is. And the blue states are states for whom public comment periods have already closed, but there still might be an opportunity to get your voice heard. And so we do recommend still looking up who's in charge of the Digital Equity Act planning process in that state and emailing them and asking how things are going. At the beginning of this week, I believe Wisconsin has opened their public comment process. So that's the state that is currently missing.
Can we have the next slide, please, Brianna?
Yes.
So this is to summarize. We put like a lot of links on the chat. They are numbered. I'm going to walk you through the steps that you need to take now. So the first thing that you need to do is to respond to this question. Has your state released their digital equity plan draft? Where do you find this information? Go to resource number 2. Look down your state and you will see who is the administering entity, whether your plan has been released, a link to the plan if it has already been released, and the date of when the open comment period ends. If it has not been released, then you still have an opportunity to advocate and make that connection and still be at the table. But if the plan has been released, then what we are going to recommend is read number 5, that is the link that we put as number 5. Read the blog and see what's happening with the commenting period. And then use the checklist number 6 to identify the different aspects on the plan. I think on the chat there was a question, a comment about expectations about language access and disabilities. So this is an opportunity for you. If this is important to you, you want to make sure that on the digital equity plan there are opportunities and plans for language access and supports for people with disabilities. So this is your opportunity to make a comment regarding that if you don't see any aspects of that on the digital equity plan. If once you have looked at the blog and the checklist and make your mind about what are the comments that you want to make, are your communities being involved? Are you represented in those digital equity plans, or your sector is included? Then you submit your comments. If the plan has not been submitted yet and has not been released yet, you still have time to do very serious advocacy here. Number 1, go to the slide deck to help you plan. This is the resource number 4. So use this slide deck. Yep.
Catalina, I just realized the links that you shared, they're only shared with hosts and panelists. Can you change your Zoom settings to everyone and resend those links? I think that's why people are getting lost.
Sure, but can you do it while I finish talking though?
I'm trying. I can't copy and paste anything right now.
I will do it right away. So if the answer is no, the plans have not been released, then you want to look at the customized checklist. I'm going to list all this again on the chat. Sorry about sending links in the wrong chat. And you can use this customized slide deck, as Shirley was mentioning. It was created in collaboration with MPI and NPNA. and look at data that you have on your state or information about your organization so you can advocate more effectively. And then check the tracker. So this is resource number 1, to make sure that you contact your state lead, and then look for opportunities to be at the table and make sure that our communities are included in the digital equity plan. I think this is all we have for a presentation. Brianna, back to you.
Great, thank you so much. As folks may have seen in the chat as well, because there were so many wonderful resources and it's a lot of great information, we will be sharing out these slides and all of these links via email to all registered attendees as well. But I do see Shirley is also putting all of those links back in the chat now for you to be able to access at this point also. Thank you again, both Shirley and Catalina. We really appreciated all of those action items, some really good concrete steps. We did get a couple of questions in the Q&A, and so we will answer those in just a few moments. But first, we're going to hear from Phil Essington, whose home state of Minnesota is nearing the end of the public comment process as well, so very timely. Phil is the Director of Broadband and Digital Inclusion for Hennepin County, which is the most populous county in Minnesota. His office builds and promotes safe access to technology so that all residents of Hennepin County are empowered to thrive in the digital world. Prior to this role, Phil led IT teams that supported the technology needs of the Hennepin County Library, facility services, and elections. He launched Hennepin's fiber optic infrastructure initiative in 2012 called Community Connectivity, which continues to ensure gigabit connectivity for school districts, cities, and residents. And then I'll just note again a little connection to the Welcoming Network. The city of Minneapolis is in Hennepin County. They connected us with Phil, and so lots of great Welcoming Network representation here today. And Phil, now I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Brianna. Thanks, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today and chat with you all and try to share some knowledge about our digital equity efforts over the past few years. They do come in the context, as Catalina and Shirley just talked about, of a kind of unprecedented wave of funding that's coming from the federal government, thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law. So I just want to, first of all, echo their recommendation and urging that everyone submit comments to your respective states as they develop a digital equity plan. All 50 states received a grant to help develop that plan, and they are bound to solicit and incorporate feedback that they receive to it. So speaking for my office, we've been very active in gathering partners and pulling together coalitions to help ensure that Minnesota's plan is reflective of all of its needs across the entire state. Along with Ramsey County, which is the second most populous county in Minnesota, Hennepin and Ramsey account for about a third of Minnesota residents, and we are home to many immigrants and refugees. The languages that we always include in all of our promotional and community engagement materials are English, Spanish, Somali, and Hmong. So just to give you a little bit of a background for where I'm coming from. Next slide, please. So I lead the Office of Broadband and Digital Inclusion for the county. Again, we have almost 1.3 million residents. We have open case files on upwards of 300 to 400,000 of our residents, be it health support, food support, criminal justice, just about everything short of library cards and elections. And so we know that we are involved in their lives. The county, like every other organization, has shifted to digital even faster than we planned due to the pandemic. And so we've paired that shift along with the unprecedented funding that we received as part of the pandemic recovery to invest more than $15 million in digital equity and broadband since 2020. So it's been my pleasure to lead these efforts. Our mission is to build and promote safe access to technology for all residents of Hennepin County so that they can thrive in the digital world. We know that we have upwards of about 100,000 households that are not yet connected to broadband. And that's for various reasons. They primarily fall into three buckets, and we're working to address all three of them. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Next slide, please. So again, I was happy to lead the technology support for the Hennepin County Library. Library, along with other departments, have been involved in digital equity for a very long time and done great work. The county took the step in 2020 with the CARES and then with the ARP funding to establish my office and fund a digital navigation team and other project and lobbying and coalition building work that has gone on to this day. And so we've met urgent needs coming about from the pandemic, and now we're starting to operationalize these services, partner with the state as part of its digital equity planning work, and then scale our services to meet needs for the long term. Next slide, please. Our primary goals are to connect all county residents to affordable, robust broadband and to support residents experiencing digital barriers. I mentioned there's basically three groups of folks. We have folks for whom there are no physical connections that can get them connected to broadband. And so we're working on physical infrastructure that will help them get connected. We're working to get folks who are eligible accessing the Affordable Connectivity Program, which of course came about last year. That's the $30 a month credit that folks can use to get signed up for broadband. And then we really see a need for folks who live in multifamily housing, folks who live in apartments. Oftentimes they're left behind. It's very hard to sign up for ACP. Folks can be left behind either in that process or in the process of signing up for their internet service from the ISP. And so we're working to provide free Wi-Fi in those locations where we can. We see a lot of benefit for that investment of infrastructure there. Next slide, please. So to the first goal, we're eliminating the unserved areas. Hennepin County has urban, rural, and suburban territory. In some of the more rural territory, we have had to do things that other places in rural America have had to do. We've partnered with ISPs, with cities and townships to get everyone connected, or at least give them access to a connection. I mentioned multifamily housing. We also established a single room occupancy model in Hennepin County. That has been responsible for our shift for a lot of folks out of homelessness into permanent housing. And I also mentioned the ACP. I have mixed feelings about the fact that upwards of 70% of ACP credits go for wireless plans. We really want to help provide people with a quality home broadband connection. And I'll talk about this in a moment. I guess we can go to the next slide here. Part of what we have done is distribute north of 12,000 devices to residents. So we have distributed brand new laptops, brand new Chromebooks. We have a hotspot lending program. We have even distributed flip phones for folks experiencing homelessness. That has been a huge piece of the puzzle in getting them stabilized into permanent housing. So bringing together all of the county's departments and really leveraging all of the expertise and resources that we can bring to bear to help people get connected. We have a huge network of community organizations that are trusted messengers and honestly have been doing this work longer than we have. We've been happy to fund some of that work, learn from them. A lot of those organizations support folks, I always say, in various languages and in various communities, many of whom support immigrants and refugees. One pledge that we've made is that everyone who works with our office gets some basic online safety training so that we are ensuring that folks aren't going out into an unknown world and falling prey or victim to some of the risks that exist online. Next slide, please. So as I say, we've enrolled nearly 53,000 folks into ACP. That's across Hennepin County broadly. We're not responsible for each one of those connections, but ACP has been hugely successful, notwithstanding some challenges that we experience alongside our residents. We have built more than 225 miles of new fiber in partnership with cities, townships, ISPs. We've gotten state grants to help with some of those projects. We work with community anchor institutions, and then we're piloting these free Wi-Fi projects in urban and suburban neighborhoods. These really center on county clients, folks who receive our services anyway, folks for whom we are trying to transition some of those services to digital. We are providing the support that lets them take advantage of these digital services with the skills, the training, the devices, and the broadband connectivity. Next slide, please. I mentioned the number of devices we're We're closer to 12,000 devices at this point distributed to county residents. And when we roll up all of the residents who we have worked with, either directly through our digital navigation team or our community partners or our broadband connectivity, there are more than 4,000 residents who we've supported in the last year or year and a half. I want to touch on the public awareness campaign that we're launching in October. One thing that we've been able to do is promote some basic online safety. We know it's important for older adults. We know it's important for young adults. It's important for everybody. So we're doing a lot of public relations work to develop campaigns, listen to community, find out. What we found is really reflected back in some of the comments that people are afraid to go online. A lot of the reason people aren't online is because they're aware that there are risks. They don't feel well equipped to deal with them. And so that's an area that we've put special focus on. And lastly, I would just reiterate, this is an unprecedented time when we total up all of the funding that the county's been able to work with from the pandemic recovery through the CARES Act, the ARP Act, the IIJA, that's the infrastructure law. That's what's propelling this Digital Equity Act and the state planning around that work. There's $42.5 billion coming about from the IIJA alone. And so our strategy has been to start this work in the pandemic, continue it through the post-pandemic period, and then look to the state for its leadership in the post-pandemic period from 2025 or 2026 onward. And we think we're well positioned to do that. We're very proud of all the accomplishments that we've had in connecting thousands of our residents, many of whom are immigrants and refugees, to broadband. We've been very happy and our residents are very thrilled to receive new computers and training on how to use them. We still have a great deal of work left to do. So we will be very busy going forward and looking to expand our coalitions and partnerships and work with organizations like the ones attending this meeting today. So I hope I can be a resource to anybody who is thinking about embarking or expanding into this work. And I can't say it enough, no matter what state you're hailing from, please do engage with your state's digital equity office, your state's broadband office. And I think the resources that I'm so glad that Brianna and Catalina preceded me here and offered all those links, because that's really the best way to leverage this opportunity for us all. So thank you. I'll be happy to work with any questions that you may have.
Great. Thank you so much, Phil. We really appreciate you sharing Hennepin County's example of what digital inclusion efforts can look like in practice. And thank you again, Shirley and Catalina, for all of the great information and resources that you both shared. With the last portion of our time today, we will turn to audience Q&A. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here so that you can see the faces of all of our speakers. And I'm going to read through some of the questions that have already been submitted into the Q&A. But also, as questions may develop for you all now as you're reflecting on what you've heard today, please feel free to put any other questions into the Q&A as well. I do see a question that just came into the chat, so maybe we can start with that one first. It says, can you talk more about online safety, best practices, the campaign around raising awareness to online safety, Phil, and then are there any resources to share around this topic?
Absolutely. What we do in terms of training, we do a fair amount of virtual training. I mean, a lot of folks who we work with have smartphones. Our goal is to enhance or improve their digital skills. And so we will work with training that's already online. We certainly do a fair amount in person as well. So I will, as we're having this conversation, I will go find some links that might be helpful for online safety skills. We use a lot of open source, freely available materials, and then just kind of assess where people are, provide the amount of training that we think is appropriate, and then verify at the end that their knowledge is there to operate safely online. So let me see what I can do even in the time that we've got here.
Thank you so much. And I'll also just mention again to folks that we will be sending out a follow-up email with this recording, all of the links that have been shared, the slide deck. And so, Phil, if anything comes up a little bit later, we can add that in there as well. A couple of other questions that have come through. Catalina, I know you referenced this during your presentation earlier, but I thought we would circle back to it just to highlight again. A question was asked about whether expectations include broad language access and access to folks with disabilities, talking about digital equity plans. So if you wouldn't mind, Shirley or Catalina, addressing that again, just to clarify.
Yeah, I think the expectation is that the digital equity plan highlight these needs and come up with solutions on how to address it. So again, the opportunity here for you, number one, if the plan has not been released, contact the administering entity and let them know how you can support that effort, that work, or why it is important. If the plan has already been released, look at the plan, see what is written regarding these needs and how they're going to address them. And if you don't see the presence of that, then an opportunity to make a comment and be very specific about the inclusion of language access supports.
Great, thank you so much. Another question we received says, New Hampshire is still in the planning phase. The requirement for a representative survey is proving to be a huge obstacle to accomplish getting them filled out. Any recommendations any of you might offer on that?
So I can talk a little bit about what other states have been doing. And I think all states kind of share this difficulty in getting the survey out, right? The default is to go to an online survey method, but when you're trying to reach those who face digital inclusion barriers, you're not going to get very many responses in that sense. So several states have done paper copies. Translations are important, like expert translations, not just run through Google Translate. Something that I think I saw in the Texas survey was that not only are there written translations, but there's also audio recordings of translated questions for those who may not be literate in their home language. Some states like Georgia have done random phone calls to just state residents to administer their survey over the phone. So that's been one way to reach those who are underconnected. But again, paper, mail-in, and then some states like Colorado have specifically subgranted some of their planning grant funds out to community-based organizations and asked them to, talk to their specific covered populations and have them complete the survey, for example, during class time or during another event that the organization might be holding. And those seem to be very successful as well.
Great, thank you so much. Those are all really great, helpful suggestions. There was a question about other resources. Someone asked whether there are resources from across the nation amplifying digital equity that we can access. So we know for sure that you all have shared a lot of really great resources with us. I don't know if in Minnesota, Phil, if you know about any particular resources, or Shirley and Catalina, if you know of other places folks might look. I will just mention for those on the call who are Welcoming America members, our member forum is always a really great place to go to ask for any of these types of requests. You can post a question in the member forum and folks will share with you any resources that they have, so we can try and do a roundup there as well. But I don't know if anyone else has something that they'd want to add on that.
So one listserv that is very popular, and I recommend everybody here to get into that, is the NDIA, that is the National Digital Alliance. And there is a lot of information online, of course, some of the resources that we posted are on our website, and there is a collection of other resources there. So I'm going to put the link on the chat in a second. Shirley, is there anything else that you want to recommend?
I suspect we might have some overlap in the links that we're about to share, but Texas specifically has some really good curriculum for low-level English language learners. So I'm going to drop those links as well.
Great, thank you so much for providing those. And I'm collecting them as well, so I can share them out in our roundup in case you're not able to take them down now. There was another question about Phil, the Office of Digital and Broadband Inclusion, wondering how that developed, whether it was part of another office first, and thinking about how to develop such an office in communities that may not have one at present.
I have to credit our county leadership and our county board. We have, as I say, a broad organization. We have HIV clinics and snowplows and libraries and a jail. As I say, we're trying to shift our transactions to digital. And I think what prompted, there was obviously a huge shift toward digital at the beginning of the pandemic. We also feel an obligation to especially help younger residents of our county. And we have 22 school districts, some of which were prepared for virtual learning and some of which weren't. So that was really the genesis of it. As far as a replicable model, I mean, I think any organization that has a stake in this work can do the coalition building that we have tried to do. There are a lot of stakeholders with a deep interest in this work, a passion for this work, sometimes a financial interest in this work. One of our closest partners is Hennepin Healthcare, which is a hospital and clinic network that's publicly owned and has a public teaching mission. Telehealth has become a huge thing. I know I try to take my kids to a telehealth appointment well before I sit in an urgent care waiting room. And that's the kind of resource that desperately wants all Hennepin residents to be connected. So pulling together these groups of stakeholders from partners into coalitions is really kind of underpins a lot of the work that we do. And I think that would be a good place for starters for anyone who's looking to get into this.
Great. Thank you so much. There was another question about best practices or models that anyone on the call may know of for language access web platforms for immigrants in the U.S. So I don't know if anyone has seen states or localities with particularly good models that you'd want to recommend. I'll note that there is a federal government website, lep.gov, that does have some resources and also recommendations for improving access to public websites and digital services for limited English proficient persons. But not sure, Shirley or Catalina or Phil, anything else that you would want to add to that?
Can we get more clarity as to what language access resources or platforms we're looking for? Are we looking for instruction or picking language access resources or translation, assisted translation?
It is not more specific than that right now, but Shirley, I do see that you put some notes in the chat.
And Zoom very helpfully stripped out all of the hyperlinks. So I'll forward you this email so that way people have the fully linked list. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
I think it's a huge
webinar
issue.
about technology and technology giving us trouble sometimes. Phil, did you have anything to add?
Sure. The translation and interpretation challenge is probably at the top of my list of areas where I know that we all need to do better. For starters, our digital navigation team has 5 people speaking 5 different languages. That's helpful. We have a language line that we can call that'll translate as much as 195 languages or something like that. And yet, when we want to send someone to a website, we know that Google Translate isn't going to be the service that we want to provide. So it is a huge issue. I was going to say our printed materials are always in 4 languages, but it's not where we need to be quite yet. And the best way we've been able to solve for it, short of the printed materials and the staff, is setting up community partnerships with organizations that can do the training. Maybe in a slightly different way, using slightly different materials, but they'll do it in a translated way. I have mixed feelings about that, since some training can happen online and some training by its nature has to happen in person, but that's the best way that we've tackled that.
Great, thank you. And actually, there's a related question, Phil, about how your office got connected with trusted community partners. Is that something where you were seeking those out? Were they coming to you, a combination? What did that look like in Hennepin County?
Yeah, I think it was a combination. I mean, we are working with groups that in some cases have worked with the county in other respects for a long time. We're also working with groups that have never done this work before. And so we're kind of standing up our organizations at the same time. The groups that we're funding, we contracted through an RFP process, but we've also got roster programs through various community engagement or programs that help us select and tailor our roster of organizations to try to meet every need that we see out there.
Great, thank you. Yeah, coalition building is always such an important part of all of the work that we're all doing. There is a question about how to share the information about the Digital Equity Act that was shared in today's presentation. I can say, as we've mentioned, we will share out the slide deck, which has links to all of the great resources that Shirley and Catalina shared in their presentation, that slide deck that they created with MPNA and MPI. Anything, Shirley and Catalina, that you'd want me to add on that, since they're your resources that I'm talking about?
Yeah, no, that's great. I think going to the recording and looking at the slide deck, you have all the resources there. Also, if there is an opportunity, we are maybe collect some of the other links that we have been putting on the chat and sharing with participants will be helpful. And also, if there are other specific questions, I think reaching to Brianna, she can put us in contact with us, or we can also share our email addresses on the chat as well. So yeah, that will be my recommendation. Go to the website and find the resources and read them.
Great, thank you. And there was a question in the chat, I think everyone can see here, that said, what about for Afghan immigrants in particular, any resources? And Shirley, thank you so much for putting a note in the chat about that. Switchboardta.org, having some digital inclusion resources in Dari. We'll share that in the follow-up email as well.
And can I add something else? So Shirley put the link already to this, but it's the Digital Skills Library. And there is an opportunity to search for languages. Currently, there is nothing, or there's like very few languages, but if you have access to resources in other languages, we are trying to build that library as well. So an invitation to join our effort to collect resources in various languages. And the link is on the chat. Again, you can contact Shirley. I'm going to put my email address in a second. That's another way of connecting with that effort.
Great, thank you. Another follow-up question here, I think for Phil. How did you accomplish coalition building? We have a situation where we need more staff to roll out digital literacy programming, but local organizations look for our staff to also be the implementers of similar digital equity projects that they'd like to implement. We're lucky to have an educator who's also an interpreter, but moving forward, a better strategy is needed. So thinking about coalition building strategy, anything, Phil, that you'd want to add, or Shirley and Catalina from your experience as well?
Well, the first thing I think of is the gap that's historically been there for these kinds of services. I mean, it's something that, at least in my experience, the cities aren't able to tackle. We have 45 cities in Hennepin County, and Minneapolis is the largest, but some of them are quite small. And the states right now have an opportunity to get some federal funding and stand up some strategies. And so I think it is a challenge kind of being in between as the counties are. And I think a lot of organizations find themselves, hearing a very clear call for these services and not having the resources. So it's a challenge. I do not have any kind of, one-line answer, but I think engaging with the state and looking for not only the state-led grant programs that will be coming about through the IIJA, but also the competitive grant programs that will be awarded by the federal government. So about half of the funding will be channeled through the states, and then the other half will be channeled by the federal government. We will certainly be watching both pools to help support and grow our work, and I think that's probably the best advice I would give others.
Yeah, I agree, Phil. I'm just going to piggyback on your answer to say that I think that this moment is a particularly good one for coalition building because there is a particular call to action. And you do now have all of these great resources that were provided by World Education as a way to do some outreach, have some practical application for folks to utilize and use that to start building out those relationships. So we are nearing the end of our time, and I don't see any additional questions right now. If there are additional follow-ups, please do feel free to reach out to us. I've shared the link here for Welcoming America, events at welcomingamerica.org. You'll be receiving that follow-up email from us with all of these resources. Again, also as a reminder, when this webinar ends momentarily, you'll be directed to our survey page. So we ask if you wouldn't mind to take a moment to provide some feedback on today's webinar. We also invite you to follow Welcoming America on our social media channels and subscribe to our YouTube channel, connect with us on LinkedIn. And finally, I just want to say on behalf of Welcoming America and all of our speakers, thank you so much to all of you who joined us, sharing time from your busy day, and for the wonderful work that you're doing to build welcoming communities for everyone. And thank you again to our speakers. We really appreciate your time. It's been really helpful, and I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of great continuing conversation and follow-up from here. So thank you all so much.